Good morning, my name is Rebecca Ramsay, and today I'll be discussing ethical decision-making, aspirations towards best practice. Late last year, I met a 16-year-old woman and her mother. For the purposes of this discussion, I refer to these women as Chantel and Peter, respectively. Peter had brought Chantel to my practice due to her concern about Chantel's recent irritability and moodiness. For a typically happy and compliant young person, Peter reported that Chantel was becoming increasingly reserved and was beginning to neglect her schoolwork. Peter was also concerned that Chantel was skipping school. Over 6 sessions, Chantel and I built rapport. Chantel disclosed that she had recently entered into a sexual relationship with a 25-year-old woman that she met online. Chantel had had thoughts for some time that she may be gay, but was fearful of admitting these to herself and others. She feared rejection from her friends and family, specifically from her mother, who was politically and religiously conservative. At the conclusion of this session with Chantel, I began to wonder to myself, was this relationship legal? Is Chantel at risk? And what's my responsibility to prevent harm? My reflexive response was to focus on legislation. I considered a mandatory report due to Chantel's age. However, through examining relevant legislation, I found that it's legal for a 16-year-old to engage in sexual activity with a 25-year-old, given that the 25-year-old is not a caregiver or supervisor. However, I strongly believe that the law only provides a minimum standard for behaviour, and my deliberation should not end here. Chantel's 16, but is she functioning as a normal 16-year-old? Due to what I knew about her accessing age-appropriate curriculum and past developmental milestones, I concluded that Chantel is able to function as a 16-year-old. So whilst I was now comfortable that this issue did not involve the law, I still had concerns about Chantel's relationship. There's a large gap in age, and I felt that Chantel could potentially be exploited by this older woman. Ethically, should I inform her mother or another third party of this relationship? I decided to utilise an ethical decision-making model to focus my thoughts. I considered various models, such as Gottlieb's 3 dimensions, but determined that the Kuchar and Keith Spiegel 8-step process best suited my situation. Employing a logical, systematic approach such as this put me at ease. I knew that it's highly defensible, and I felt confident that it usually leads to a better solution. Considering breaking confidentiality is an ethical issue, and so I consulted the ABS Code of Ethics for preliminary guidance about my situation. I found the 3 principles in the Code of Ethics were all relevant for different reasons. For example, pertinent standards in the principle respect included justice, in that I needed to assure I was not discriminating or showing favouritism towards Chantel on the basis of her age, gender, or sexuality. Confidentiality, in that I needed to assure the collection, recording and accessing of Chantel's information was confidential, and informed consent. So whilst I had assessed Chantel in her first session as being able to give informed consent, I may need to reassess at a later date if her mental health deteriorates significantly. Issues around autonomy have also been found to be common when working with young people, and this applied to my work with Chantel in that I needed to assist her to make her own decisions. A few standards also stood out to me regarding propriety. So first, competence. So fortunately, I have had experience working with LGBTQI young people before, and so this wasn't really an issue for me. I thought about collaborating with others and that I would need to keep Chantel's personal information confidential when talking with my supervisor about this case. Professional responsibility, in that I needed to take reasonable steps to prevent harm as a result of my conduct with Chantel. And lastly, integrity, specifically in my commitment to the best interests of Chantel and being aware of my own personal bias. Whilst I consider all mentioned standards, as well as others, as important in practice, working through the code enabled me to pinpoint where my dilemma lay, in upholding confidentiality and client autonomy while protecting Chantel from harm. Then I looked at the guidelines, and these clarified and elaborated my understanding of the code. So I realised I would need the consent of Chantel to share information with her mother. I should consider the best interests of Chantel as paramount, and I would disclose information about Chantel if there is an immediate and specific risk of harm that could be averted by sharing the information. So I knew that Chantel did not consent for me to share information about this relationship, so I needed to determine the level of risk of the relationship. Was there an immediate risk of harm to Chantel that could be avoided by disclosing? While researchers contend that there is no consensus on how to determine if a certain behaviour is dangerous enough to break confidentiality, I considered a few factors. Is the relationship exploitative? I was specifically concerned about Chantel's skipping school, as this has been cited as a possible indicator for exploitation. Also, does Chantel's mental health place her at immediate risk of harm? Are there any indicators of self-harm or suicidal thoughts? And how does her mental health interplay with the relationship? My next session with Chantel revealed that she is skipping school at the request of her partner. However, there are no other signs of exploitative behaviour. Chantel's mental health has also deteriorated, but not to the point of immediate risk. Chantel reiterates that she does not want anyone else to become aware of her relationship. I then took some time to consider factors that may bias my decisions. I recognised my sensitivity to child abuse, as I have worked closely with victims of child abuse in the past. With these young people, I have a tendency to protect, and I realise that this can be at the detriment to the young person's autonomy. I then take what I've learnt about the code and my personal bias to my trusted supervisor. She cautions me against breaking confidentiality, especially with young people. She's witnessed vulnerable young people stop seeking support and lose faith in the psychology profession. She also suggests that I engage in some further learning about LGBTQI young people in order to work well with this group. So next, I consider the rights, responsibilities and vulnerabilities of all parties. This includes Chantel, her parents and a new partner. Due to Chantel's vulnerability, in that she's a young woman lacking support networks, poor mental health and is skipping school, I take care to consider her rights as paramount. Again, I consider her right to privacy and to autonomy, and I also briefly consider Peter's right to the truth and how I can be honest in my interactions with her. So I thought about a few options and the consequences of each. First, I considered partial disclosure to her mother, where I would tell her about Chantel's relationship, but not that it's with a woman. However, I may lose Chantel's trust. Second, I thought about what would happen if I didn't do anything at all, but Chantel may be at risk of harm now or in the future. Finally, I consider working with Chantel to better understand her sexuality and grow in her identity. Perhaps in the future, she'd be ready to have a supported conversation with her mother about her sexuality, and we could perhaps integrate this into one of our sessions. So in this case, I decided to maintain confidentiality and continue to support Chantel through this period of her life. I will continue to assess risk and be wary for changes. For example, if Chantel tells me she plans to run away with her partner or suicidal ideation emerges. I'll provide resources for Chantel to explore her identity safely and discuss with her the risks, benefits and stresses involved in the coming out process. Lastly, I will continue to seek professional support from my supervisor about this case. Working through the ethical decision-making model in the current case has taught me about making decisions in ethical matters. I couldn't rely on the code and related guidelines to find black and white answers, and I had to interpret and apply the code to my situation. And I had to make decisions along the way. Was Chantel at immediate risk? What action would best prevent harm? Working through the code, I found all principles were inextricably linked. Ethical issues are not contained to one standard or principle, but are usually complex combinations that need careful consideration. I found reflecting on my own bias as the most useful part of the decision-making model. In my opinion, this is what stands this ethical decision-making model apart when compared to a knee-jerk reaction. I found that professional supervision was also needed for support and to assure that I'm upholding my practice standards. Professional collaboration has been cited as the most important factor for making ethical decisions, especially when pertaining to issues of confidentiality. Lastly, addressing confidentiality with young people and their guardians right from the outset is so important and sets the boundaries for your work with the individual. This specific learning about confidentiality is likely what will most impact my future practice. This conversation should be frank and thorough and could include follow-up questions to check for understanding. I found some practice recommendations to be used when discussing confidentiality with young people. For example, explaining confidentiality in the context of caring rather than the law, being very specific about what you can and cannot discuss confidentially, and clearly communicating about grey areas. I hope you've been able to gain some insight into making ethical choices today using an ethical decision-making model. Thanks for listening.